our last speaker for today is Nicholson Price. Professor Nicholson Price will talk about the stakeholders' roles in promoting quality and trust in medical AI. Unfortunately, okay, welcome, Nicholson, welcome. So Nicholson is a professor of law at the University of Michigan. He promised to me that next year he will be here.
All right, thanks so much for having me. And I'm sorry, deeply sorry that I can't be there in person. I really wish I could be. And who knows, maybe next year, if I get invited back, I'd love to be there. So I'm here wearing 3 different hats. First, I'm a professor of law at the University of Michigan. Second, I'm co-PI of the project on precision medicine, AI, and the law at the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard Law School. And third, I'm a core partner at the Center for Advanced Studies in Biomedical Innovation Law at the University of Copenhagen. So I'm thrilled to be involved in all 3 of those organizations and happy to be talking to you here today about stakeholder roles in promoting quality and trust in medical AI. This is a more of a 30,000 foot or a 10,000 meter, I guess, view of the topic than what you've just been hearing. I'm thinking about this as kind of a very broad systemic level design and who are the entities that are involved in promoting trust and quality. So just as an overview on what I'll be talking about, I think of the key stakeholders here as being in 3 buckets, at least the stakeholders that we can think about influencing. Obviously, there are lots more. Patients are an entity that I'm not talking about because I think they're not as deeply involved in the design of the systems, but clearly they're hugely important. But I want to focus on 3 important entities. So we've got regulators, and since I'm in the US, I'll be mostly talking about the US Food and Drug Administration in that context. Providers, both health systems and individuals, physicians, nurses, physician assistants, and the like. And then slightly less typically, insurers. And I'm interested in thinking about both payers, the ones who are covering the cost of health services, and also providers of liability insurance, like for medical malpractice or other forms of liability. And the relationship between these 3, all of which impact patient trust, and also trustworthiness, right? Because trust without trustworthiness, without the underlying quality that makes trust reasonable, if trust doesn't have trustworthiness and underlying quality, it's ultimately fragile and illusory. So right now, patients may be trusting the system. If they stop because there are system failures, or if we fail to engender trust by being trustworthy, that's likely to cause increasing problems down the road. So on to the bulk of this. First, I want to talk about regulators. And as I mentioned here, I'm mostly thinking about the US FDA. I'll be highlighting throughout some collaborators that have been doing this work and then noting down below some of the work that this talk is drawing on. So here, this is work drawing on work with Professor Rebecca Eisenberg here at the University of Michigan and Rachel Sachs at Washington University in St. Louis. And so regulators have a key role in ensuring safety and efficacy, which is obviously an essential aspect of quality for medical AI systems. And here I'm thinking of medical AI systems as devices, whether that's software embedded in a medical device or software standing alone as its own medical device, which is most of what I'm thinking about, things like diagnostic systems or recommendation engines. So this safety and efficacy role is often conducted pre-market. In the FDA context, that's mostly been through pre-market clearance, a relatively looser regulatory hurdle than the full kind of intense pre-market approval pathway. Honestly, I think the FDA and European regulators have been doing a great job in this space. The FDA I'm much more familiar with, but they've been working with industry and trying to reflect how the field of medical AI is different from classical medical devices and how we should think about the possibility of products changing, what development looks like, what sorts of evidence works enough. They've been much more flexible than I had feared as these products started to be developed. Some issues that remain, though, are questions of representativeness versus bias, which is to say the data that are collected for the development of medical AI are often non-representative of patient populations, especially if these products are being used in a widespread way. And it's hard to demonstrate, right? As I'm sure many of you know, it is difficult to demonstrate generalizability and the representativeness of data. And I think that this is still in its infancy in entering the regulatory system. So if we want to demonstrate trust across patient populations and across a wide variety of places, demonstrating that representativeness of data, the generalizability of models is going to be an essential task for regulators to take up. Similarly, almost everything, perhaps everything approved or cleared so far has been a locked system, meaning it's been trained and then the final algorithm is set, rather than a learning system where the algorithms are changing pretty frequently or on the fly. Obviously, the second half of that system, or the second half of that dichotomy, right, learning systems are much more able to cope with things like data set drift and model shift. And so the fact that those are not currently fitting within a regulatory paradigm is a challenge that regulators are going to need to figure out how to deal with. There's some wonderful work by Evgeniu Babic, Gerke, and Cohen out in Science, I think 2 years ago, talking about this essential challenge. But as much as regulators can do, there are some real limits to what they can do, which is part of what makes space for other stakeholders to matter so much. So in particular, the development of in-house medical AI is a real blind spot for, or not a blind spot, just an area of non-coverage for regulators. Here, again, I'm thinking specifically of the US FDA, but in the US, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of medical AI models that are already being used, developed, and deployed in the context of hospitals and health systems or by electronic health records vendors that are not seen by FDA at all. They don't go through any sort of FDA review. They are just used and deployed in site. Regulators don't see them. That is a deep limit in terms of how FDA can serve a quality guaranteeing function. The second big limit is in terms of context specificity. As any of you undoubtedly have discovered, if you have tried to take a medical AI product in one context and then applied it to another context, right? You developed it in one hospital, try to use it in another hospital, particularly if they are different in any significant way, right? That is a challenging task. It is not at all easy to say at a centralized level, this AI product works generally, rather than saying it works in this particular context, in this particular place, for this patient population, for this pattern of care at this period of time, right? That sort of context specificity in terms of quality guarantee is really hard for centralized regulators. And last, at least again, in the context of the US, the term medical device, which is what FDA needs to be able to regulate something, has been legally circumscribed such that if there's a human physician in the loop, if the system makes recommendations to a physician rather than doing, for instance, providing an autonomous diagnosis, then it doesn't count as a medical device. And FDA, again, doesn't regulate that AI product. So lots of regulators can do at the core at this commercialized product deployed widely in lots of instances. There's a lot regulators can do and that I think they're doing well, but there are many limits to how widely they can stretch and how much they can demonstrate that products are going to work in one particular place rather than another, which is why I think other stakeholders matter so much here. So one particular stakeholder is the provider at the provider level, health systems themselves, hospitals, academic medical centers, health systems. This is work with Karendeep Singh here at Michigan Medicine. And here I think about distributive governance. So when we think about hospital committees that are deciding whether to implement an AI system, how can they work to ensure local efficacy, to make sure that the system is integrated into a workflow so that insights are actionable rather than just promoting alert fatigue and here's another alarm that the clinician is unlikely to follow because there are just too many of them. This is going to involve not only decisions about how to implement a particular system and how to integrate it at the front end, but continuous and constant validation and review of these systems to make sure that they're still working as patterns of change and individuals change, as patient populations change over time. This is hard, but it's absolutely essential to make sure that systems work in context. Now, a real challenge that arises from this is the places that have effective models for this sort of distributed governance, for this idea of here is how committees of clinicians can work with information technology to ensure that AI is working well in their systems. Those are places with lots of resources, at least for now. They're big, fancy hospitals, academic medical centers, places like Cedars-Sinai or Duke or Michigan or Harvard or Stanford. To the extent that we think that a big benefit of medical AI is the possibility of extending care, as was just mentioned in the last presentation, equity of access, that's much harder to do in places with fewer resources to do this sort of oversight. We can also think about providers at the individual level. And this is work with Glenn Cohen at Harvard and Sarah Gerke at Penn State University. How much can individual providers validate performance in the moment? We're used to saying, of course, the buck stops with the doctor. They're the one who ultimately makes the decision. But if part of the goal of medical AI is to make sure that doctors can do more than they otherwise could, that general practitioners can check for diabetic retinopathy, even though they aren't trained, how easily will they be able to validate those results if they lack that training? Potentially an easier metric is to say, providers should be enabled to check on procedural safety metrics, to know some sort of signal about medical AI products. How can I be sure that this was developed in an effective and safe and representative fashion? This too is going to demand metrics that will demonstrate these facts to people who are frankly not machine learning specialists and never will be. Two last points on this. It's very easy in any individual instance for a physician to say, well, I know that the machine recommends X, but I know my patient, and the answer for my patient is Y. And that may sometimes be true. But it's often going to be very easy to think of that as the answer. And in the aggregate, if the algorithms are performing well, we know that that simply can't be true. And the question of how to thread this needle, how to distinguish between this is my patient and I know their circumstances versus the machine knows best, is a central task of engendering trust on the behalf of physicians, but also on the behalf of patients. Liability is not a particularly helpful tool here. Physicians face the potential of liability, but that doesn't really shape their ability to think about how to engender trustworthy systems versus how to just avoid risk. The role of insurance payers, another key stakeholder here. When payers decide to reimburse for a system, they're performing a certification role. They're saying, or at least they can be. They can be saying, yes, this is safe and effective. The challenge, and one that I hope the payers will rise to, is how should they set payments and incentives right? Because if payers don't pay for high quality systems, if they don't pay this certification role, it's very easy for institutes and health systems to just take the easy road, to apply a generalized product that is supplied by an electronic health records vendor without taking on those difficult responsibilities of making sure that it works in their context and making sure that it continues to work in their context over time. And last, I want to turn to a different type of insurer. Sorry, that was work with Mark Sendak and Suresh Balu at Duke. Last, I want to turn to insurers' role in terms of liability insurers, medical malpractice and other liability. This is with Ariel Stern, Timo Minson, and Avi Goldfarb. You might not think that liability insurers are important for engendering trust in medical AI, but to the extent that they can shift the risk and they can mitigate the risk, they can reduce the uncertainty of adopting health systems and physicians about using these new tools that hopefully should be fixing and improving medical care. These insurers have the potential to play a profound role in enabling systems to actually adopt AI and in making sure that the systems that are adopted are high quality as a way of minimizing the risk that they themselves face. So I'll close with that. This is a tremendously exciting area, but the trust issues are frankly quite substantial. We need to understand more empirically of the work on the ground, but more than anything else, we need to recognize there's no one actor who has the ability to solve these challenges. Instead, it's going to demand the efforts of multiple stakeholders across multiple settings, and coordination and recognition of those different roles will be essential to getting this right and moving the field forward for the benefits of systems, clinicians, and most importantly, patients. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and thoughts.